A cop thought he was catching a suspicious man, until he realized he had just arrested an FBI agent. What happened next turned his entire department upside down. The warm breeze of a late summer evening rustled through the quiet streets of Brookside Heights as David Carter strolled along the sidewalk. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he moved with a sense of quiet confidence, occasionally glancing at the houses and jotting notes in a small notebook. To him, it was just another evening. To Officer Ryan Blake, parked at the corner in his patrol car, it was something else. Watching David closely, Ryan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. A lone man walking through a neighborhood he didn't seem to belong in? Suspicious. Ryan flipped on his headlights and rolled forward, pulling up beside David. Stepping out, his hand brushed against his holster. "Hey, you!" His voice was sharp. "What are you doing around here?" David turned, his expression unreadable. "Evening, officer. Just doing some work." Ryan squinted. "Work? You live here?" David shook his head. "No, but—" Ryan cut him off. "Then why are you here?" The cool evening air settled over Oak Ridge Heights, but the tension between Michael and Officer Craig crackled like a live wire. The street, once quiet, now pulsed with quiet murmurs from onlookers who had paused their evening routines to witness the unfolding scene. Michael remained still, his posture measured, refusing to let the officer's aggression rattle him. His hands were raised slightly, his notepad still clutched in his fingers, but his gaze remained locked onto Craig's, calm, steady, and unshaken. Craig, however, was far from composed. His fingers hovered near his holster, his mind racing to justify his actions. The man in front of him, dark-skinned, unfamiliar, and unwilling to bow to his authority, wasn't just another pedestrian in his eyes. He was a threat, a disruption in the carefully constructed world Craig had convinced himself he was protecting. "I said, hand over the notebook," Craig barked, his voice laced with frustration. Michael exhaled, slow and deliberate, measuring his words. "Officer, I haven't committed a crime. I don't have to give you anything." The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing the volatile shift in energy. A young woman on the curb clutched her phone, her screen illuminated as she recorded every second. Others followed suit, their faces tense with anticipation. Craig sneered. "Is that so?" He reached for Michael's wrist, fingers clamping down with unnecessary force. Instinct took over. Michael jerked his arm away, his voice firm but controlled. "Don't touch me." That was all it took. Craig's anger flared. His hand shot out again, this time grabbing Michael's shoulder, yanking him forward. The movement sent Michael stumbling slightly, but he quickly regained his footing. The crowd gasped. A few took a step forward, unsure whether to intervene. "You're resisting," Craig growled. Michael's jaw tightened. "I'm not resisting. You're escalating." The words did nothing to deter Craig. The officer reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I have a suspect refusing to comply." "I'm not a suspect," Michael interrupted, his voice sharper now. "I'm a federal agent." For the first time that night, Craig hesitated. A beat of silence stretched between them as the crowd collectively held its breath. Michael slowly reached into his back pocket, moving with calculated precision, and retrieved a leather badge holder. He flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable emblem of the FBI. Craig's face paled. The shift in his demeanor was almost comical, a mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and barely contained panic. The younger officer, still standing by the patrol car, stepped closer, his brows furrowed. "Wait. What?" Michael nodded, his tone unwavering. "Special Agent Michael Carter, FBI." He let the badge sit in the dim glow of the streetlight, ensuring that both officers, and the watching crowd, got a good look. "I've been working an ongoing investigation in this neighborhood, and now, because you couldn't bother to ask a single question before jumping to conclusions, you may have just jeopardized months of undercover work." A few gasps rippled through the bystanders. The recording phones tilted slightly, capturing Craig's expression, a blend of disbelief and humiliation. The sergeant's voice suddenly crackled over Craig's radio. "Craig, what's going on out there?" Craig didn't respond. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. Michael took a slow step forward. "I suggest you let me go. Now." Craig swallowed hard, his fingers twitching as if still debating whether to double down or back off. He cast a quick glance toward the growing crowd, toward the cameras documenting every second. Finally, with great reluctance, he released his grip on Michael's arm. Michael exhaled, adjusting his jacket before turning to the younger officer. "Get your sergeant on the phone. Now." The younger officer fumbled with his radio, nodding quickly. "Yes, sir." Craig, still reeling, took a step back, his gaze darting between Michael and the growing sea of recording phones. His confidence had drained away, replaced by a sickening realization. This wasn't just a bad call. This was career-altering, and it was far from over. The street was silent, save for the low murmurs of the growing crowd. Michael stood tall, his FBI badge still open in his hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Officer Craig's face was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, confusion, and a creeping sense of fear. His grip on control, which had felt so solid moments ago, was slipping fast. The younger officer, clearly caught off guard, pressed his radio with a shaky hand. "Sergeant, we have a situation here. The suspect, the individual, identifies himself as a federal agent." A sharp crackle of static followed before the sergeant's voice came through. "Repeat that?" Michael didn't wait for them to get their bearings. "Patch me through to your commanding officer now," he demanded, his voice even but carrying an unmistakable authority. The younger officer hesitated, then nodded, relaying the request. Craig, still standing rigidly beside Michael, clenched his fists, his pride visibly cracking under the weight of his mistake. "What's your problem?" Craig finally snapped, his voice lower now but no less aggressive. "If you're FBI, why didn't you say something earlier?" Michael's eyes locked onto him, unwavering. "Why didn't you ask?" His tone was quiet but sharp, slicing through the air like a blade. Craig opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He had no answer. Moments later, a patrol car came speeding down the road. The sergeant had arrived. Sergeant Mills, a stocky man in his 50s, stepped out of the vehicle, his sharp gaze flicking over the scene. The moment he spotted Michael, still in cuffs, his expression darkened. "Craig!" Mills barked, marching toward them. "What the hell is going on here?" Craig straightened, his jaw tightening. Caught him wandering around suspiciously. Wouldn't identify himself, refused to comply. He's a federal agent, you idiot." Mills cut him off, his voice dangerously low. "And you just put your career on the line for no damn reason." A hush fell over the crowd. Craig's face flushed, but Michael wasn't finished. "I've been running an undercover investigation in this neighborhood," Michael said, turning to Mills. "Tonight was critical. Certain individuals were supposed to make a move. Instead, because of this officer's recklessness, my cover is now in jeopardy." Mills looked like he was about to explode. He turned on Craig. "Get those damn cuffs off him." Now Craig, stiff with resentment, yanked out the key and unlocked Michael's cuffs with jerky, aggressive movements. The moment the metal snapped free, Michael rolled his wrists, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. "I want a formal report filed," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I want to know how you plan to handle this." The sergeant exhaled through his nose, clearly furious but knowing there was no way out of this. "We'll take care of it, Agent Carter." "Not good enough," Michael shot back. "Because I know how this usually goes. Officers like him get a slap on the wrist and are back on the street in no time. And the next person he does this to?" His gaze hardened. "They might not have an FBI badge to protect them." The crowd murmured in agreement. Phones were still recording. Craig shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "This is harassment," Craig muttered, his voice low but still laced with defiance. "I did what I thought was necessary." Michael turned to him, stepping closer. "You didn't think," he corrected. "You assumed. You saw a black man in a hoodie and made up your mind before I even had a chance to speak." Craig bristled. "That's not—" "It's exactly what happened," Michael interrupted. "And you know it." Silence. Craig had nothing to say. Mills ran a hand down his face, exhausted. "Agent Carter, let's take this conversation inside. This isn't the place." Michael considered for a moment before nodding. "Fine." He turned to the crowd, speaking loud enough for the cameras to pick up. But make no mistake, this isn't over. With that, he followed Mills toward the police station, leaving Craig standing in the middle of the street, the weight of the night settling over him like a crushing force. And somewhere in the back of his mind, for the first time, he wondered if he really had been wrong all along. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the tense atmosphere. Michael sat across from Sergeant Mills in a small, windowless office. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. Craig, now visibly tense, stood stiffly by the wall, arms crossed. He looked like a man trying to convince himself he was still in control, even as his world tilted dangerously beneath him. "Let's go over this again," Mills said, rubbing his temples. "You were conducting an undercover operation in this neighborhood?" Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "That's right. The FBI has been monitoring criminal activity in the area for months. Tonight was supposed to be a critical moment. I was gathering intel on a possible meeting between key suspects." He exhaled sharply. "And thanks to your officer here, that operation is now compromised." Craig scoffed, shaking his head. "So what? I was just supposed to ignore a guy lurking around houses in the middle of the night." Michael's jaw tightened. "Lurking?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I was standing on a public sidewalk writing in a notebook. But that didn't matter to you, did it? You saw a black man in a hoodie and decided that was enough." Craig's face flushed red. "That's not—" Mills held up a hand. "Enough," he snapped, turning his gaze to Craig. "Do you even realize how badly you screwed up?" Craig's jaw twitched, but he said nothing. Mills exhaled through his nose, then turned back to Michael. "Look, Agent Carter, I understand your frustration and I take this very seriously. But you know how this goes. We'll conduct an internal review, and the department will handle disciplinary actions as necessary." Michael leaned back, folding his arms. "No," he said simply. Mills frowned. "No?" Michael shook his head. "That's not good enough. I want a full report filed with Internal Affairs. I want Craig off the streets while this is investigated. And I want a public statement from this department acknowledging what happened here tonight." Craig stiffened. "You've got to be kidding me." Michael turned to him, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" Craig let out a bitter laugh. "You want me fired over this? Over doing my damn job?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "Your job?" He shook his head, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Your job is to protect and serve, not profile and harass. Your job is to assess threats based on evidence, not your own biases. Instead, you put a federal operation at risk, endangered lives, and humiliated yourself in the process." Craig opened his mouth to argue, but Mills cut in. "Enough, Craig," he said, his voice weary but firm. "Go wait outside." Craig hesitated, his pride refusing to let him back down. "This is bullshit," he muttered, but he turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. A heavy silence settled in the room. Mills sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is a mess," Michael nodded. "And you need to fix it." The sergeant looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he gave a short nod. "Fine, I'll start the paperwork for Internal Affairs first thing in the morning." Michael studied him carefully. "And the public statement?" Mills hesitated. "I'll talk to the chief." Michael wasn't satisfied, but he knew when to push and when to let things play out. He stood, smoothing his jacket. "I'll be following up." Mills sighed. "I figured you would." Michael turned toward the door, but before he left, he glanced back. "One more thing, Sergeant." Mills looked up. "If you really want to fix this, don't just sweep Craig under the rug. Ask yourself how many other officers in this department think just like him." With that, Michael walked out, his posture steady, his mind already working on the next steps. Outside, Craig was pacing in the hallway. When he saw Michael, he stopped, his expression still defiant. Michael didn't break his stride as he passed him, but he did pause just long enough to say, "You might want to start thinking about what you're going to do next, Craig, because this isn't going away." Craig didn't respond. Michael walked out of the precinct and into the night, But he knew this fight was far from over. Michael stepped out of the precinct, the crisp night air hitting his face as he took a deep breath. The street outside was quiet, but the weight of what had just happened inside still clung to him. He had seen men like Craig before, officers who let their own biases shape their decisions, who thought a badge gave them unchecked power. But this wasn't just about Craig. It was about the entire system that allowed people like him to operate without consequence. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw the name, Agent Holloway. "You're out?" Holloway's voice was sharp, all business. "I'm out," Michael confirmed, stepping toward his car. "But we have a problem." A pause. Then, "How bad?" Michael exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. Craig wasn't just acting on instinct. He was confident. Too confident. Like he knew he could get away with it. "I need to know if there's a pattern here." Holloway sighed on the other end. "You think he's done this before?" Michael opened his car door but didn't get in. He scanned the quiet street, his mind working through the possibilities. "I don't think. I know." There was another pause. Then Holloway's voice turned darker. "I'll start digging. Be careful, Carter. If there's a history, he won't be the only one who wants this buried." Michael hung up and slid into the driver's seat, his mind already on the next step. He wasn't going to let this go, not this time. The next morning, the precinct was anything but calm. The Internal Affairs Department had already begun reviewing Craig's record, and the tension in the building was palpable. Officers whispered in hushed tones, their gazes flickering toward Craig whenever he walked past. He could feel it, the shift in how they saw him. He had always been the one calling the shots, the one who knew how to toe the line without crossing it too far. But now he was a liability. Sergeant Mills approached him, his expression unreadable. "Chief wants to see you." Craig clenched his jaw. "This is ridiculous." Mills didn't respond, just motioned for him to follow. Craig straightened his back, ignoring the stares as he walked toward the chief's office. Inside, Chief Reynolds sat behind his desk, his expression a mask of controlled frustration. To his right stood a representative from Internal Affairs. "Close the door, Craig," Reynolds said. Craig did as he was told, his gut tightening. Reynolds didn't waste time. "You've put this department in a bad position." Craig scoffed. "For what? Detaining a guy who wouldn't cooperate?" The IA representative, a stern-looking woman named Karen Whitaker, slid a file across the desk. "For racial profiling, abuse of authority, and misconduct, Officer Craig. And if we find what we think we're going to find, possibly worse." Craig opened his mouth, but Reynolds raised a hand, cutting him off. "We've started reviewing your arrest records. You have a pattern, Craig. A pattern of targeting black men without probable cause." Craig's pulse spiked. "That's—" "Not all," Whitaker interrupted, her tone icy. "We've received multiple complaints against you over the years. Most were dismissed. Lack of evidence, procedural excuses. But after what happened last night, we're reopening them." Craig's stomach dropped. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "You put your hands on an undercover FBI agent. Do you understand how serious that is? Do you understand how badly you've embarrassed this department?" Craig clenched his fists. "So what? You're just gonna throw me under the bus?" Reynolds shook his head slowly. "No, Craig, you threw yourself under the bus." Meanwhile, across town, Michael sat in Holloway's office, reviewing files that had just come in. The more he read, the angrier he became. Craig's record was worse than he had expected. Not just minor profiling, excessive force reports, wrongful arrests, even a complaint about planting evidence. "How the hell was this guy still on the force?" Michael muttered. Holloway folded his arms. "Because no one looked hard enough. Until now." Michael closed the file. "We take this public." Holloway hesitated. "You sure? If we release this, it won't just take down Craig. It could expose the whole department." Michael's jaw tightened. "Good." Holloway nodded, reaching for the phone. "Then let's make some calls." Back at the precinct, Craig sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. He knew what was coming. It wasn't just about the internal affairs investigation. It wasn't just about Michael Carter. It was bigger than that. He had played the system for years, convinced he was untouchable. But now the system was finally turning on him. And for the first time in his career, he was afraid. The tension in the precinct was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officers who once shared casual banter with Craig now avoided his gaze. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and the weight of his own decisions was finally sinking in. Michael, meanwhile, sat across from Agent Holloway watching as news outlets began to pick up the story. Headlines flashed across the screen. FBI agent illegally detained by local officer. Investigation launched. Racial profiling scandal shakes police department. Michael leaned back, his face unreadable. "It's out now," he said. "No more cover-ups." Holloway nodded, his expression grim. "This isn't just about Craig anymore. The entire department is under scrutiny." Michael exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Good. They should be." At the precinct, Craig sat in the chief's office, facing Sergeant Mills and the internal affairs team. His badge lay on the desk in front of him. It felt like an anchor, holding down what little remained of his career. "Officer Craig," Chief Reynolds started, his tone severe, "you are officially placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. Pending further investigation, your badge and weapon are to be surrendered." Craig stiffened. "This is not up for debate," Reynolds interrupted, his patience worn thin. "Your record is full of complaints that were ignored for too long. Not anymore." Craig clenched his fists. "So that's it? You're just throwing me to the wolves?" Reynolds leaned forward. "You did this to yourself." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Craig grabbed his badge off the desk, staring at it for a moment before setting it down. For the last time. As he walked out, he could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him. Some looked away. Others nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the inevitable. His time was up. Outside, protesters gathered, their voices echoing through the streets. Justice for all. No more cover-ups. Michael stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the city he fought to protect finally started demanding the change it deserved. And this time there was no turning back. The story of Michael and Craig is more than just a moment of injustice. It's a reflection of the deeper issues that still persist in 2025. Despite progress, racial profiling, misuse of power, and systemic bias remain challenges in law enforcement. This story serves as a wake-up call, reminding us that accountability and reform are not optional. They are necessary. In 2025, technology and social media continue to play a major role in holding people accountable. Body cameras, public oversight, and AI-driven analysis of police interactions are tools that can prevent abuses of power, but they mean nothing if the culture within law enforcement doesn't change. This story urges police departments across the country to prioritize de-escalation training, reinforce anti-bias education, and strengthen community oversight boards. For everyday citizens, this is a call to stay vigilant and involved. Speaking up, recording injustices, and pushing for legal reforms are not just rights. They are responsibilities. The world won't change overnight, but if people continue to demand justice, stories like Michael's won't be as common in the future. If 2025 is to be different, it starts with us. Will we rise to the challenge? Michael's story is a powerful reminder that silence enables injustice, but action creates change. Now, it's time for us to take a stand. What would you have done in Michael's shoes? What changes do you think law enforcement needs to make to prevent situations like this? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Support Michael by spreading awareness. Share this story, start conversations, and demand accountability from your local officials. Reform doesn't happen overnight, but every voice matters. If you believe in justice, equality, and real change, let's make sure Michael's fight wasn't in vain. What should his next step be? Let's discuss.